get, we are going to record this. All righty. Let's see. Schwinn, are you able to keep admitting people?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Excellent. All righty. Well, I'm going to kick us off. Thanks everybody for joining, and especially thank you, Amy Westervelt, for joining us on this lovely Wednesday. For those of you who don't know, I'm Amanda Milstein. I'm a pediatrician based in Northern California. I'm one of the co-founders of Climate Health Now. And we are really, really excited to welcome Amy Westervelt today to talk about fossil fuel disinformation and health. And my top priority is to hear from her as quickly as possible. But just to frame things a tiny bit about why are we here today? So all of us here on this call are part of the health community in some way, and we are climate health advocates. We know these facts about what is happening as a result of fossil fuel combustion and the life cycle of fossil fuels, that air pollution and other contamination from fossil fuels is killing millions of people across the globe prematurely each year, including in the United States. We know that fossil fuel pollution is associated with all sorts of poor health outcomes. Just to name a few: respiratory disease, heart disease, strokes, cancers. For me as a pediatrician, things that resonate most deeply with me are things like childhood asthma, premature births, low birth weight. And we know that fossil fuels are the dominant contributor to climate change, accounting for more than 75% of greenhouse gas emissions. And the reason this, the sort of so what is that the fossil fuel industry is actively working to block progress on climate fronts and air pollution fronts. And we know that to move forward with the speed that this moment calls for, it's essential that we act against, that we take on the fossil fuel industry and call out the health harms that they are causing. And so that's why we are here today, to learn from and talk with Amy Westervelt. For those of you who don't know Amy, she is an investigative reporter and a journalist. She spent the last 20 years reporting on climate for a really large number of outlets: NPR, The Guardian, The Wall Street Journal, to name a few. And today she runs an organization called Drilled, which is an independent multimedia newsroom focused on climate accountability. If you've never listened to her podcast, Drilled, this is the most listened to climate podcast in the world. I would highly recommend it. And she is also the author of a forthcoming book called Brought to You By, which is about the fossil fuel industry's role in creating our disinformation problem today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Amy, and I am hopeful that this will we'll have lots of discussion and questions. Where Amy's going to talk for the first part, and then we'll open things up to discussion. So feel free to put questions in the chat, come up, and then also, I think depending on the size of the group we end up with, we probably will just be able to have people come off mute as well. Alrighty, so Amy, I am going to stop sharing and turn it over to you.
Awesome. Okay, I'll keep an eye on the clock too, and if we're getting short on time, I'll wrap it up so we can get to questions. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen here. Let's see. Do that and then that. Okay, so when I talk about this stuff, I talk about it as information pollution, because I feel like one thing that sometimes gets lost in the conversation around disinformation is that the sort of building blocks of how we understand this issue have been warped. So yes, we have disinformation now, it's a problem, but I almost think about it as like, I don't know, the algae that blooms when a watershed has been polluted. It's like the thing that's noticeable, but there's a whole kind of system behind it, which is why, is why we need to tackle it. Oh no, I can't advance my slides. Oh dear, we have our first problem. Hmm.
Amy, do you want me to? I have your slides in my slide deck. Do you want me to show mine and
Yeah, let's see.
do
Now
that?
it's not letting me. Oh, geez, it's locked up. My screen's locked. Yeah, maybe you can click stop sharing. Sorry.
Okay. Oh no. Okay.
Oh,
Okay. Let's try.
no. Oh no.
Okay. Oh, now you guys can
Oh,
see.
there we go. Okay.
Wait, are you sorry.
No, it let me control it once I stopped sharing, but not while
Okay.
I was sharing. So
Okay.
sorry.
Let
Sorry about
me
that.
sorry guys. Let me okay. Sorry. No one can see.
Maybe if I just share it as like a small instead of full screen. Let me see if that works.
You want to try
Hold
that? Okay.
on.
If not, I'm gonna go
Yeah.
and unhide. Okay, so I'm gonna stop my share. You try again.
Okay. Let's see if that works. Yeah, that works. Can you
Okay.
guys see this? Sorry, it's smaller now.
Yeah.
Hopefully that's okay. Okay, so the data is clear. Amanda just talked about it too. Um, there's quite a bit of attribution science now that has connected climate health to various climate change to various poor health outcomes, including, the way that heat waves impact people, premature deaths, 21 million additional deaths by 2050, according to the World Bank. There are lots and lots and lots of climate related health issues. The one I've been obsessing about recently is the link between climate change and pathogens and new pandemics. So all kinds of things on top of air pollution, asthma, all of that stuff. Um, and the drivers of the climate crisis are connected to more immediate health impacts too, right? So the combustion of fossil fuels is the number one contributor to air pollution. It also contributes to a lot of water issues. Overconsumption of animal products is a big contributor to climate health. Also not great to climate change, also not great for human health. So a lot of things that need to be done to address the climate crisis are also good for health. So I feel like it's important to note that there's really nothing contradictory in in any of this stuff. um why medical professionals? I think that medical professionals are consistently rated as amongst the most trusted messengers on any kind of topic. Medical experts have helped turn the tide on this information in the past, and the fossil fuel industry is starting to do what they did in lots of other instances, which is to target medical professionals themselves to get people who work on human health to push back against the idea that climate change is a big problem or that fossil fuels are a big problem. They're trying to discredit the science, not just on climate change itself, but also on the link between climate and health in particular. As what we think of as like old school climate denial has kind of died away, especially in terms of how the oil companies talk about it. I know there are still plenty of people who still think that climate change is a hoax, but as oil companies have moved away from that messaging, they have tried to undermine attribution science, which is what is connecting climate change to all of these other outcomes. So there is a pretty direct connection there. I want to talk a little bit about why we have this disinformation problem to begin with, and there's a direct connection back to the medical profession there too. So I mentioned before, I talk about it as information pollution. Part of that is that the way information is manipulated goes way beyond just media manipulation and advertising. I'm talking about investments in university research, hiring management consultants to come up with economic models that include some things but leave certain indicators out or certain costs out. Even really unsavory things like surveilling and harassing critics of the industry. Or like I know researchers who have testified to Congress about disinformation and then been followed and had their families followed by people connected to the industry after that. You know, making sure that people show up in certain pictures together to try to make things look a certain way. This is all part of the whole kind of ecosystem. And it goes back to the late 1800s, and a guy named Ivy Lee, this is him here, who worked for the Rockefellers. He worked for Standard Oil. He also worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad. And part of what they were trying to do was push back on early regulations. So, you know, you had the first regulations being passed on corporations. You had the vote expanding to people who maybe didn't share the interests of the Rockefellers and their ilk. And, you know, you had workers unionizing, you had journalists doing big exposés. This was all happening right around the same time. Corporations needed a way to reshape the narrative and gain more control over regulation. And this is where kind of corporate PR came from. And the use of fake experts to try to undermine what other experts were saying was one of the first tactics that they used. So Ivy Lee created this thing called the Bureau of Railway Economics in the early 1900s. And it seemed like a, you know, legit economists organization. They would put out research and white papers. They would send it to the press. They would print these out and leave them in train stations and on trains as well. And it was all paid for, commissioned by the railway to push back against regulations that were asking them to better staff their trains because they were having so many crashes, actually. So it starts really, really far back. This is a famous quote from Ivy Lee. Way before we got, you know, alternative facts, we had Ivy Lee talking about his interpretation of the facts. And the first use of fake experts after that was doctors. So this is Edward Bernays in the 1920s. He had a bacon client. They needed to sell more bacon. And he had the genius idea of hiring a bunch of doctors to say that a heavier breakfast, maybe one that included bacon, was actually healthier than the sort of light breakfast that Americans were eating at the time. So within, you know, a few years, this idea of like bacon being part of the American breakfast was everywhere. A bunch of newspapers printed this study that he had commissioned from doctors, and this whole thing took off. Today, you know, the American breakfast on the menu at any diner always includes bacon, but it was like, you know, just for a client. Bernays was also Sigmund Freud's nephew, so he used a lot of like psychoanalytic theory in his approach to working for clients and trying to shift norms. And again, like the bacon example is very straightforward. You know, they were trying to sell more stuff, but he also did things like, you know, people would come to him with gender taboos around certain things. So like he had a watch client that wanted to break down the taboo against men wearing wristwatches, because apparently real men had pocket watches at one point in time, and wristwatches were seen as feminine because they looked like bracelets. So he commissioned a study where they found that soldiers would have less risk of being shot at in the trenches if they had wristwatches instead of pocket watches that they were like lighting a match to see. No idea if this data was valid at all, but it was accepted enough for the US Army to make wristwatches standard issue, and away goes the gender taboo against wristwatches for men. So that's the kind of thinking that we're dealing with here. It's much more involved than like, oh, they got a story about this or they did an ad campaign about that. Obviously, using doctors to cast doubt on tobacco research was a big one for a long time. People forget that that was also a PR guy. It wasn't the tobacco companies that came up with that. It was John Hill, who was also working for oil companies at the time. Oil companies were the ones who came up with the cigarette filter. I feel like this is a little factoid that's been lost, but they were co-defendants in all the tobacco litigation because they were the ones that came up with the idea for a filter that would make people think they weren't ingesting toxins. For them, it was a way to sell more plastic. So, so that's like the history of what we're dealing with. For me, I like when people ask about disinformation, or if they don't ask and I'm just trying to break through to people who maybe don't know all this stuff is going on or are resistant to it, I think the most effective approach is to focus on facts and data and primary documents. So I did a story a few years ago where a bunch of crab fishermen had sued the oil companies, and their suit was basically saying, because you obstructed climate policy for so long, we're now in this position where our industry is being threatened by climate change. And half of the people that were named plaintiffs in that suit told me they didn't believe in climate change. I was like, that's okay, that's interesting. How did you sign on to this suit? If this is something that you don't believe in, why would you go to the trouble of being a named plaintiff in a lawsuit against the world's biggest oil companies? And their answer was that they've been shown primary documents. So in particular, in that case, they were shown patent applications that the oil companies had taken out to prepare their industry for climate change. So this was like tankers that could navigate a melting Arctic, offshore oil platforms that have been re-engineered to deal with sea level rise. These are patents that they took out in the 70s and 80s. So they were preparing at that point for, okay, this is happening and we need to get ready for it. And the argument that some of these crab fishermen used with me was that, for them, they're like, it doesn't matter why it's happening. They knew it was going to happen, and they prevented us from preparing, even though they were preparing for it. So primary documents, very, very helpful. And then there's a ton of peer-reviewed studies now on the connections between climate and health. The Lancet countdown kind of brings them all together every year. There are a couple of really big kind of seminal studies in Nature and JAMA that show very conclusively that these things are linked together. I don't know. Sorry. Okay. Case studies of examples where people in the health profession have talked about this, and it's worked. Like it's worked to, spur some kind of change or at least shape the conversation. The Lancet countdown is a big one. It's become, highly covered every time it comes out. People refer to it a lot. I think at least a lot of journalists I know refer to it as, just a very credible source on this stuff. And one of the ways that I'm kind of like, oh, this must be working well, is that every time it comes out, both the fossil fuel industry and the animal agriculture industry really kind of campaign against the findings. So, it included some big stats on air pollution last time around, and there was a big push to, kind of downplay that from the industry. The year before that, they had a big thing on meat consumption and how it was linked not only to climate change, but also all of these other issues. And the animal ag industry mounted a huge social media campaign to try to undercut it. None of it really seemed to work because they had done such a good job of making sure that the research was solid and making sure that the headlines were connected to hard data. Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. This is interesting because they have really focused specifically on the disinformation. So they are connecting, the climate problem and fossil fuel combustion to health, but they're also focusing on how the industry has kept those things in play with bus bench ads, billboards, and then a whole kind of media campaign as well, which is interesting. The Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health, they've really focused on the economic impact for the healthcare system that climate brings. So the increase in people coming to the ER during wildfires, heat events, extreme weather events of various other kinds. I think this is like, it's a good example of, look, this is a big topic and there are lots of different avenues to plug into here. It might, for some people, I think it might be more comfortable. It'd be like, look, this is going to be more expensive for the institution that I work for as time goes on. For others, it might be, you know, a little bit more involved. But this has been taken up by multiple politicians as, you know, something that justifies improving policy on this issue, the cost. Okay. One thing I think is useful to look at is that other industries have tried to tackle this, and the way they've done it is an approach that I think health professionals might want to consider too. So it is, you know, within the industry, but also trying to work with people that are kind of outside critics as well. So the PR and advertising industry is an obvious one, and clearly they have more culpability here as well. But there's been worker-led campaigns within some of like the PR and ad firms that worked for oil and gas. There's been campaigns outside of them. Those campaigns have now led to the UN calling for a crackdown on climate disinformation and the formation of some federal and state policies around it as well. Oops. Okay. That's it for my spiel. But like the main thing I think is important to know is just like, as many layers of disinformation that there are, those are also all areas where I think health professionals could be quite helpful. And it gives a lot of different avenues for people depending on their comfort level, who they're interacting with on a regular basis, you know, what their network is, what their interest level is, all of that kind of stuff. I'm going to stop sharing now. Hold
Okay.
on. There.
We'll keep it in this view. Amy, thank you for sharing all that. And I'm seeing things pop up in the chat. So I think we'll open things. I was going to kick us off with a sort of general question, and then I'm super curious to have people share any questions or thoughts. I think for some of us, you know, this is stuff we know. For others, I think it can be surprising to learn all of this. And I'm really curious to dig in on that. The question, Amy, I just wanted to ask right off the bat is, from your vantage point, you know, we're an audience of health professionals. Many of us are based in California, but there are folks here from across the country. What advice do you have for us in terms of how we can best use our voices to combat this disinformation and misinformation campaign that is ongoing by the fossil fuel industry?
Yeah. I mean, I think it depends on, the what can I do question is something that I get from lots of people who are in lots of different professions and places and whatever, right? And my answer tends to be the same, and it's a little bit of a guidance counselor answer, which is like, well, like, who do you know? What are you good at? What are you interested in? What do you have access to? What's your network like? Like, you know, could you talk to patients one-on-one? That's helpful. Are you part of a broader community group where, I don't know, like some people are part of their local Rotary Club, for example, and are like giving talks at places like that. Some people are able to, you know, have the time and energy and everything else to actually work on policy. Like, can you work with local policymakers on specific policies that might address this? Working with campaigners, all of that stuff. I think it sort of depends on who you are and what you have access to. But I think the biggest need is really for all of it to be happening at once. It's an unfortunate reality that, like, it all needs to be happening. So like, so really it's sort of like anything you can do is going to be helpful, even if it's just talking to like the very small group of people that you know in your life, or only, you know, the patients that you know are receptive to it, or, you know, like all of it is helpful. I think people get really overwhelmed by like, oh, I have to fix this huge problem, but like, you're not alone. No one person is going to be able to solve it. Lots of other people are working on it, and like, you have to work with what you have. Um, so yeah, that's my answer. Sorry if it's kind of a cop out. I don't have a like super
You
one
can't tell
size
us.
fits all answer.
You can't
Yeah.
tell us exactly how to be. Um, that would be
Another
it.
thing, actually, I do think like if anyone has a relationship with a university, either, you know, you work at a university, you work through a university, you're an alum that's active in your alum network, there's a huge kind of issue boiling up around fossil fuel funding of university research and how that lays the groundwork for a bunch of other stuff. So like we just looked at where I'm like down the rabbit hole on a project on this, so it's sort of like coloring everything I see. But there is a huge amount of fossil fuel funding in not just in the context of like carbon capture research and hydrogen research and like research funding for all of the industry's preferred solutions, which by the way also come with major health impacts, especially carbon capture. It's really dangerous on a public health standpoint. There are kill zones around compressed carbon pipelines. And this is an industry that hasn't done a great job of managing the pipeline infrastructure that already exists. So that's a whole issue that's coming. But you know, they fund research on preferred solutions to try to get, you know, white papers that then they can present to Congress, and to build relationships with the researchers who then go and testify to Congress for them and who sell the public on the issue as well. But they also are big, big funders of economics programs, public policy schools, like really all of the things that create the context for pushing their preferred policy as well. So yeah, if you have any sway at all with a university, there is a big push to try to at least require disclosure and transparency. Because right now, we don't even know how much money and what it's going to, and what the terms of that money are. What are the strings that are attached? Because every contract I've ever seen, and you know, they're really hard to get at, but occasionally you'll find someone that will send it to you or whatever. They always include some amount of influence. It's like, we want one of our, I mean, Princeton had an Exxon staffer working at their environment center for 5 years. You know, they want to pick the projects. Stanford, that was it no longer exists, the energy center there, but for a long time they had an energy center that was started by Exxon and a couple of other oil companies, and part of their contract was that they got to pick the research projects. So they don't tend to give big donations without any strings attached. So yeah, if you have connections to try to push for at least disclosure and transparency. And the comparison that people always make is like, look, this already we already have these guardrails for tobacco, pharma, fast food funding, some chemical funders, you know, in like the food and public health space, there are already guardrails around disclosing funding, but it just doesn't exist for fossil fuel funding. That includes for journals too, academic journals. Most of the climate journals do not require disclosures like that. So that's another area where, you know, I think it would help, because it kind of like stops the disinformation before it starts. You know, yeah.
If anybody has questions or wants to jump in, feel free. I think we can just raise your hand. I'd say.
Oh, this question about training for health professionals to talk with patients, that does exist. I'll send you, I have a couple links that I'll share after this. Because there have been a couple of people working on it. And I think it seems like it would be huge to train more people on doing that. I don't know that, yeah. I mean, it seems like a difficult conversation to have. I don't envy you guys being in that position. um, but yeah. Uh,
I think I
yes,
saw.
sorry, Karen, yeah. Oh, and
Hi.
Rachel.
Yeah, thank
Yeah,
you. I did put something in the chat about options people have to uh, advocate in their workplace for some fairly major issues like public transportation with clean vehicles. Um,
yes.
this is something that should be an ask of every employer, especially if you work for a large corporation, because they have lobbyists that can act on your behalf. Um, and it's a pretty widely supported uh, issue in that you can bring people together in solidarity around things like this, and to have things like clean school buses that your kids are riding in, um, as well as other options for transportation like trains and
Yeah,
things that are supported. Um, as far as talking with people about what's really happening with these issues, like continued fossil fuel support, is that our money from our paychecks goes to 401k investments
yeah,
that often are heavily divested in two things. One, oil and gas exploration right now, and the other is in building pipelines. Sometimes the pipelines, they have no direct relationship with oil companies. They're independent groups of construction people who are building these pipelines to nowhere, maybe. But they get tremendous amount of funding to do that. And then something is going to go through that pipeline eventually. We don't know what, whether it's toxic chemicals that are created in factories built at one end that go to ships that go to another end. We don't know, so to demand transparency from your 401k and that those investments go for life and error affirming uh, investment, because that's not necessarily where the big money is. There are kickbacks, there are incentives for all investment companies and employers. They invest some of it too, uh, for their purposes, to
yeah,
get in on the profits right now for oil and gas. We've got to stop the flow of this money, and only we can do it. So inform yourself, ask that your company be a clean energy supporter, and that will change this. And the only other thing I wanted to add is there are some issues that healthcare people, which I am one of, um, need to address related to rural populations. It has some
yeah,
very significant air quality issues that are a little bit different than rural people, but really need to be staff needs to be educated about this if um, if you are serving a rural population. It's really there's a um, option for information called AgriSafe, and they have seminars about this all the time, about these kinds of things, um, for rural areas and farmers and farm workers. So I can put them in the chat too. Thank you.
awesome. Rachel has her hand up. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi. I'm on a walk, so it's my day off. So I was like, I'm gonna walk and listen. I wanted to first say I've been listening to Drilled for a couple of years, and it's such an honor to be able to like talk to you and be able to have you present. I just think that you do such fantastic work, so I wanted to put that out there first. And then I wanted to ask a specific question on your perspective, given how entrenched you've been in disinformation in the media. What is your perspective on what sort of positive media has been doing or already accomplished with kind of the opposite, like rather than having fake experts, having real experts embedded in the media? And a specific topic that maybe you can address is related to an NPR story that I read yesterday about how the meat industry has been marketing like meat eating as like this to men. You will have increased virility, masculinity if you are a meat eater. And the article essentially quoted like, if we can just get men to eat less meat, we'll make a huge dent. Like if we can just address that demographic, we can really make a huge dent in decreasing emissions. So I was curious what your perspective was about that.
Yeah, well, the meat industry, well, animal ag in general, so like meat and dairy and all of that is so interesting because they're actually big users of nutritionists to push. I'm hesitant to say false narratives because they're sort of like there's some grain of truth in there, right? But just to like push an agenda of like getting people to eat more meat. So I went to I snuck into an animal ag conference last year, and there were all of these panels on how to convince people that meat is actually healthy. So that's one where I actually feel like doctors are huge because there is a giant and very well-funded push right now in amongst especially cattle ranchers and dairy producers to not just position meat as manly and like weirdly patriotic. It's sort of the same as oil, this like patriotic American thing around meat, but also they're really leaning on the health issue as being a key kind of seller of that as well. And we looked at there was a really interesting study that Jennifer Jackett at University of Miami did. It just came out earlier this year, where she looked at just sort of like how this stuff works in food versus oil and gas. And what she found was that where fossil fuel companies love the idea of framing climate as like an individual action issue, that like we're just supplying and demand, if you guys drove less, there wouldn't be so much oil and gas, right? The animal ag industry hates that framing. they lost their minds when Meatless Mondays came about, because it went from being, oh, these crazy environmentalists just want everyone to be vegan, to, oh, go plant-based one day a week. That's not a huge deal. Also, it's like better for my health, so why wouldn't I do that? They lost a huge amount of market when that started to happen. And so they're like, they just approach it in a very different way, where they hate the idea of individual choice even being a factor, because that actually will hurt their bottom line. Whereas for the fossil fuel industry, they're kind of like, I mean, the US is never going to transition off of meat entirely, right? Like, it's not like it's just a very different question for that industry. But it's important to think about because they're second to fossil fuels, but not by that much in terms of contributions to greenhouse gases and climate change. And that's one where the health question has a really, really huge role to play, because it is the thing that the industry is trying to lean on to claim that people should continue to consume that product. And they use like, they pay for registered dietitians to promote that thing. There were these two women that I saw at this conference who do a podcast that's paid for by Bayer, which is the current owner of Monsanto. And their whole podcast was about food bullying. This is another thing that industry loves, is like framing it as like, even talking about meat eating being, bad for the planet, or like not necessarily healthy to, consume lots and lots of meat, as being bullying people. So they're like standing up for the right to eat meat and, stop bullying me for my diet and like that kind of thing. But there were these two women who were both registered dietitians who do this podcast, and they do a bunch of social media, and they're 100% like pay for play. They're just like, call us, so these people are in amongst us, and it'd be very, very helpful to have a unified voice from the medical community saying, no, actually, overconsumption of meat is bad on multiple levels. Yeah. And that seems like one that's easier to talk to patients about too. So yeah. Yes, Amanda. Other Amanda, sorry.
Amy, so much for coming on and talking. I've been listening to your stuff for years, so I'm a huge fan.
Thank you.
And it kind of has to do with what you were just talking about. So like media, like you're saying, they have this podcast is a huge part of all of our lives. And for us and for our patients, how can we kind of filter through the media that is telling us the right information? And like, how do we know that it's reliable? And then we're, as physicians, like trying to be evidence-based, and some of these researchers are being paid off. How can we know if they're being paid by oil or not?
Well, the unfortunate answer to that is that it's very hard to tell. They don't always disclose that funding. You can do, it's tough because a lot, like, navigating the grocery store, a lot of it is being left up to individuals to figure out on their own because there isn't any kind of regulation on it. So unfortunately, the only way to really figure it out is to look into that person. I usually I will, Google someone, see all of their affiliations, and be like this person's given an awful lot of talks at the American Petroleum Institute or whatever, and you can kind of tell, but it's not always that obvious. And if they don't have to disclose it, then it's really, really hard to tell. This is where I feel like actually leaning on both universities and academic journals, because academic journals require disclosure for conflict of interest for pharmaceuticals, tobacco, a bunch of food related health things, but they don't require it for fossil fuel stuff, and they should. But there's a bunch of energy and climate journals even that don't require disclosure of fossil fuel funding, which I find crazy. So yeah, the unfortunate answer is it's hard to tell. On the media side, kind of parsing through what is and isn't to be believed, or who is or isn't influenced or compromised or whatever, is hard too. The unfortunate reality is that a lot of people really are pretty compromised, and you kind of have to take one piece or maybe one person at a time and figure out, whether they're coming from a good place or not, acting in good faith or not. I'm trying to think of a good thing that you could tell patients. I always, maybe this is maybe too infantilizing, but I'm thinking of my kids are getting in an age. My older kid is a consumer of TikTok and YouTube videos. So, but he talks to me about it, which is the requirement. If you're gonna watch that stuff, you have to tell me what you're watching and talk about it. So he's always like, "Did you know that whatever?" And it's something, and I'm like, "Where did you hear that from? Who paid for it? What's the research?" I do like to give people to be like, "Oh, well, what's the data that's based on?" A lot of times when I ask people that, they get kind of defensive, but that's not terrible because it kind of challenges them to like prove me wrong. And then in doing that, I swear I have had so many people be like, I couldn't find anything actually that backed up that thing that I believed. So it does, sometimes that works. I think things to stay away from would be like, oh, you know, don't watch Fox, they're terrible. Because if someone is a regular viewer of Fox, they're not going to take that well, right? Like you have to find ways to encourage them towards doing their own critical thinking, I guess really is the goal. But it's tough. It's hard to navigate. I know plenty of journalists that get duped by stuff too. So yeah, it's a mess out there. Sorry, Amanda.
Oh, other Amanda. Okay, I'm actually showing a question from Alex Sharif,
Okay.
who put this in the chat to me. I'm going to just read the question out loud. And this is Alex, I happen to know, is located in the Central Valley in California, which is a place where we have lots and lots of carbon capture and sequestration that's coming in. And so his question is, from your perspective, what disinformation do we need to be especially vigilant about regarding CCS and also hydrogen? Yeah.
And hydrogen too. Yeah. Okay. So I did a story on CCS recently that like I've been covering this stuff for a long time, and it still totally blew my mind that they're getting away with so much on CCS because it is basically an oil production technique that's been rebranded as a climate solution. That's like the quickest way I can think to explain it. When you have dwindling oil reserves, right? The oil is like stuck in most places in the US. Oil is stuck in rocks, right? And it's easy to get out for a while, no problem, but then it starts to settle and it's harder to get out. And you have to inject something into the rocks to get the oil out. And the first thing they do is water. That works for a while, but then it starts to dwindle even more. And actually the best thing is compressed carbon. It's really, really good at finding all the bits of oil and sucking them out for you. And that is why they started doing carbon capture in the first place, was to do that. The other thing to remember is that most natural gas comes out of the ground with a bunch of CO2 in it. It's not just pure methane gas sitting there for the most part. So CO2 has been a waste product for the industry itself to deal with on gas for a really long time. And they, for a while, had this system going where they would drill for gas, separate out the CO2, and then use that for, it's called enhanced oil production, injecting the compressed carbon underground to get more oil. Close to 80% of the captured carbon that currently exists in the world is used for that. So that is its primary use. The other thing to be aware of is there are enormous concerns around how and where we're going to store this stuff and how we're going to move it around. So in most cases, if it's being used for enhanced oil recovery, right, you're usually not like co-located with an oil field. You're capturing the carbon at like an ethanol plant or a power plant, and then it needs to be piped to wherever the oil field is that you're going to use it, or it's being piped to a permanent sequestration area. There's been no geological surveying done of the supposed permanent sequestration areas. So like when we store nuclear waste underground, there's an intense amount of geological surveying that happens. People are like, well, nuclear waste is dangerous. Compressed carbon is very dangerous. If it leaks, it will kill people. There was a huge leak in the town of Satarsha, Mississippi a couple years ago. It actually makes cars on the road stop immediately because it like messes with the engine. So a bunch of people in this town, this is such a creepy image, driving along, all the cars stopped. People were like falling out of their cars dizzy because they were gassed with CO2. People were showing up at the hospital. Like it's not a good scene, and then on top of that, it kills like anything around it if it leaks out. So again, these are pipelines that are moving this very dangerous substance all around, being built by an industry that has thousands of spills from their existing pipeline infrastructure every year. On top of that, like the best potential outcome climate-wise for carbon capture is a 2.1% reduction in global emissions. That's the best case scenario. And that is if you have carbon capture connected to concrete, steel, or fertilizer manufacturing. It does absolutely nothing to connect it to power plants. Maybe it keeps some CO2 out of the air. Maybe it helps a tiny bit with air pollution, but not really. And most of the carbon capture technology, it requires energy. It's not like some passive device that's just sitting there. It's powered by energy, most of it more fossil fuel energy. So it's like, to me, I'm just like, this is a huge gamble. It's a huge health risk. It's really expensive. And every single expert body has said that it's like the last thing to do once we've decarbonized in all these other ways, but we're doing it first. And the reason we're doing it first is because the fossil fuel companies have lobbied very well and very effectively for the 45Q tax credit, which gives them $80 per metric ton for permanently sequestered carbon and $65 per metric ton for carbon used in enhanced oil recovery. So they're being paid to use it for getting more oil out. When I asked, well, how do we know? Like, it's all self-reported, it's a tax credit. So how do we know if they're storing it or using it for this? What's to stop them from just claiming that it's all being stored? The answer to that is nothing. It is the biggest government giveaway to the oil industry that we've ever seen, and they're and it's somehow been sold as a climate solution. So yeah, those are. Oh yeah, thanks, Amanda. There's my article. Yeah, there's like a bunch of stuff linked to in that story that it's quite useful. But there's also there's a do you know Sandra Steingraber? She has done a lot of really, really interesting stuff on particularly the link between CCS and health risk. Very, very like worth checking out her stuff as well. But yeah, it's just there's so little potential benefit, and the thing that it would have benefit for is not what we're actually using it for right now. Yeah.
Sarah, I was gonna say, if you want to have the last question, and then we're just gonna close out with a quick announcement, but we're getting close to the end of our time. Do you want to have the last question?
I ranted about carbon capture for too long. I'm sorry.
But this is an open audience that's open to that. Do not worry. Sarah, do you want to ask the last question?
Yeah, is that Sarah, me?
Yeah, yes.
Excellent. Hi, this is Sarah Zimmerman with Climate Equity Policy Center. And I had a question about counter marketing. I'm curious, I feel like that's sort of a theme woven through some of what you've talked about today. And I'm curious what that looks like in today's world where, these fossil fuel companies back in the day could just like buy up big newspaper ads and TV ads on the major stations and like reach everybody. So I guess I'm curious, like, how much money would it actually cost? Like, what's the scale that we would have to engage on if we were going to do an effective counter marketing? And what does it look like in terms of social media and all this, like, by, many times divided media?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually feel like it probably looks like heavily focused on social media and much less so on traditional media. Cost-wise, I'm not a great person to say, but probably on the order of like $10 million. It's going to be a big number. And there are actually organizations that are doing some really interesting things on this front around social media. So one of the things and I can give you information about, there's one organization in particular that is doing a lot of this where they're partnering with influencers and just sort of like giving them the information they need to produce videos. And they're not going for like climate influencers, they're going to like mom influencers in the Midwest, or like one of theirs is like a guy who is an oil worker actually in the Gulf. There's a few other ones. So they're doing that, and then they're also creating like white label podcasts as well with these influencers and doing stuff like that. Another organization I know of, they took this actually from like a Steve Bannon strategy, I guess, but they looked for like accounts on Instagram that had been really active for like some period of time, had a bunch of followers, and they were like legit followers, not bots, but like weren't super active anymore. And they bought them, which I didn't even know this was a thing you could do. They bought people's accounts, and then they started to like very slowly like repurpose them for this. So there was one organization in Brazil that I talked to that did this in their political in their last national election, because everybody was very worried about Bolsonaro getting reelected, right? So they bought up all of these celebrity gossip accounts, and then they partnered with with some of the celebrities in Brazil to like they would basically be like, oh, this is happening in the Amazon, can you tweet about it? And then they would do that, and then they would like take a picture of the tweet and put it in the Instagram account. So it's this very like very clever way of like getting that audience, kind of on side, but in this very subtle way. That is, I think, probably the most effective way to try to reach lots of people, is like, sneaky social media campaigns. I hate to say it, but I think it kind of is. And I do think that, talking to the folks in the TV and film industry is helpful as well, to try to get some of this stuff into what they're producing, not necessarily in a like, producing a climate show kind of way, but even just like, could your main character be like driving past a solar field every day? Or, could this family be grappling with whether or not to have more kids because of climate change or whatever, like there's like ways to work it in. But yeah, I think it's expensive, and unfortunately it has to be very diffuse and probably not leaning so much on traditional media. Volts is a great podcast. I agree. Yeah, it's really good. Yeah.
We're Linda, could we fit in one last question? I see your hand and I know we're also at 1:30. I don't know, Linda, how long your question is.
Thanks, Amanda, and thank you very much, Amy. My question is, are there organizations that you think are doing really good work on directly countering the fossil fuel industry? And who are those? Because we might want to partner with them in adding a health voice.
Yes. There's a group, the group I was thinking of before, that's doing all the social stuff, and I think has done a good job of just figuring out what will work with different audiences and how to find them and, get them the information. They're called ACE. And I can't even remember what that stands for, but I will, hold on, let me just, maybe I'll send you info on them. And I know like the person you should talk to as well. So I can send that to you, Amanda, after this, and we can share. I do think that there are a few different organizations that have kind of coalesced around the whole like polluter pay idea. So this idea that, fossil fuel companies should be held accountable. And one of the things that they've done recently that I think is really smart is actually laying the blame for high gas prices at the feet of oil companies, which is actually where it belongs, because the industry did a really good job for a while of being like, oh, climate policy is making gas expensive. It's like, what climate policy? This is even before the IRA. I wish that was true, but it's not. the oil companies were making record profits, so that's been, I think, a helpful talking point. And I don't mean to say, that traditional media is not worth talking to or trying to get on side at all. It is still very influential. It would be great, for example, if every news anchor knew that the talking point about climate policy making gas expensive was false, and could have the understanding of how gas prices get set to push back on that kind of stuff. Same with health outcomes. If having someone from your group connected to a producer at CNN who will regularly book that person to come on and talk about climate and health whenever there's a related story is actually really helpful. So what group? Sorry. Yeah. I think, oh wait, no. I don't know if that's them.
That's what is it?
Yes.
Action for the Climate Emergency. Okay.
Yes. So they have this whole front-facing group that does all of these things on their website, but they have this whole counterintelligence unit that does really, really interesting stuff. And yeah, it's great. They're really great. I can't remember the name of the person who runs that right at this moment, but I have her contact info, so I'll send it to you because I feel like that would be a really, really good partnership. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Amy, we're now 3 minutes over, so we will.
Sorry.
No. I feel like personally, I could come up with a million more questions and take all your time, but we do need to end it. Thanks everybody for being here. Amy, I'm going to follow up with you to get some specifics, and I will share them out with everyone who registered. Perfect. And then we'll have a recording of this as well, and I'll share that out with everyone as well.
Awesome.
Thank you. And Amy, thank you. And thank you for your work. And I'm hearing lots of chatter to me in the chat of I'm so used to hearing her voice on podcasts. This is so cool. I agree. I feel that way too. So thank you so much. And
thanks for having me.
Right. Yes.
And yeah, I'll send you stuff for sure. I'm sure I'll think of other things as soon as we hang up too, that I'm I should have told them about this. So yeah.
I can be a conduit of information. Yes.
Okay. Awesome. Bye. Thanks everyone.
Bye.